All right. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar online. My name is David Holland, and I'm the Director of Impact and Public Policy at WestAF. I'm an African American with brown skin and a clean-shaven head and face. I'm wearing a pink shirt, and behind me is a black filing cabinet and a few monitors. So first, a little housekeeping. All mics will be muted and cameras off for the duration of the session for those participating. If you have a question, please write it using the questions feature by first clicking on Live Now, the Live Now icon, and then questions. You will see a question mark next to the questions tab, and there you can enter a question. The last 20 minutes or so of this session will be devoted to a Q&A moderated by my colleagues on WestAF's policy cohort. If you'd like to share something about the Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar, which we call at WestAF ALAS, please use the hashtag ALAS 2021, ALAS 2021 for all your social media posts and communications throughout the event. So now I will, as is a practice for WestAF convenings, offer a land acknowledgement. So with respect, WestAF would like to acknowledge that the lands we occupy today are the traditional homelands of a number of indigenous nations and peoples. We recognize that we are talking in an online space, but that the spaces we are physically residing in are in what is now the Western region and across the United States are also the current and ancestral lands where diverse indigenous communities have lived, gathered, and healed. We recognize these indigenous nations as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. We recognize Native and Indigenous peoples are an integral part of our community, resilient in responding to and healing from a legacy of violence, displacement, and migration. We also recognize the resilient nations that remain an integral part of our communities today. With this truth spoken, we hope to build mutual respect and connection across barriers of heritage and difference, and share our gratitude for the Native American, Indigenous, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander communities that lead, inform, partner with, and support the work of WestAF. Humbly, we commit to continue learning from our Indigenous leaders. All right, so now I'll briefly introduce my panelists before getting started. You have access to all of their bios using the speakers tab on your left, but in summary, here goes. First, starting with Alensa Mitchell, who is off camera, but you will be hearing from her today. Alensa Mitchell is a social practice artist, a poet, and a writer, an organizer, a policy advocate, and a researcher. Alensa has been an inspirational voice in national conversations on the creative workforce and other topics. As a program officer for humanities, arts, and culture at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Alensa manages the Commission on the Arts, a historic initiative of the Academy that explores the role of the arts in public life under the leadership of arts luminaries. Heather Noonan is a career arts advocate and lobbyist and an arts policy leader with particular interests in education, immigration, and cultural exchange. As Vice President for Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras, Heather represents the interests and concerns of 1,600 orchestras nationwide. Heather is also a partner to the Cultural Advocacy Group, an ad hoc coalition of national and regional arts and cultural organizations and associations that aligns federal arts and cultural policy agendas. Hal Reel is one of the leaders and architects of Save Our Stages. As a board member of the National Independent Venue Association, Hal also serves as the chair of the board of our sister regional arts organization, Mid-Atlantic Arts. Hal is an attorney, a business owner, and nonprofit executive, an advocate, and a believer in the power of music to unite. Thanks, Alensa, Heather, and Hal, for joining us for today's conversation on new directions in arts policy. I'll pose my first question in a few moments, and I ask that when you first speak, you state your name and describe your appearance for our participants today. All right, so let's kick off. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and I'm going to start with just framing this conversation and inviting all of you to speak to what do you think are the most important federal arts policy issues before us today in this moment? What would you like the participants in this session to walk away with in terms of what they should be paying attention to and what our priorities should be as a field? I will start with you, Alensa, and then we will invite others into the conversation. So how would you respond to my first set of questions?
All right. Well, hi, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, David. I apologize. I am having technical difficulties, and so I'm unable to join you all on screen. My video is not working, but I am an African-American woman, and if you could see me, you would see that I have a head wrap on and big earrings and full-fledged, sort of representing my African and Caribbean culture. So I think the big picture question, and I'll try to align it with the work that we're currently doing at the Academy. This past year has been one that has been particularly devastating to the arts and culture sector. We have seen not only the inherent value of the arts, but also how historically, because the arts have been undervalued, the deep impact that the pandemic has had on artists and cultural workers. And my hope is this will catalyze a reframing of the conversation around our needs, and will allow those who may not be connected to the arts or may not see the arts as vitally important to the soul of America to really relook at it in that way. We are nothing if we are not representative of our culture and we don't have a means to celebrate who we are. And now more than ever, I think the arts are needed, just as the same, now more than ever, the conditions that we've been facing have been all the more exacerbated.
Thank you so much for that, Alensa. Heather, what are your thoughts?
Sure, thanks, David. So my name is Heather Noonan, and I have white skin, shoulder-length red hair, and behind me in my home office is an Irish drum on the wall. So I would say in terms of big areas of focus, it's kind of two things. One is that we are in a long, ultra long distance marathon on advocacy efforts. And that the way for us to succeed as a sector in intersecting with the policy decisions that are being made right now are to create and cultivate relationships with policy leaders that can endure over time. So though COVID kind of had a really big spark in terms of rallying around arts needs and an arts presence in policy, the need to continue to engage in that activity is going to be a very long-term need. And one of the things that kind of is proof of that is just looking at what is the federal policy agenda right now. So at the federal level, we have ourselves in this moment of needing to focus, I think, on three big areas of federal policymaking all at once. So one is to have some influence on the remaining COVID-19 relief conversations underway. But at the same time, with the new Congress taking office, we have our full slate of existing and ongoing federal arts policy issues to attend to. And then at the same time, the third piece is engaging with a new administration and being present in all of the policy conversations that intersect with how federal agencies support the arts ecosystem. And that third piece, if there's one thing to take away from it for me, is a reminder that there is a lot the federal government can do to support the arts systemically without an act of Congress. There are a lot of decisions taken by federal agencies, including and beyond the cultural agencies, that impact the ecosystem. So being able to stay our course, keep our energy level high, and be managing all of these areas of opportunity is kind of a big focus right now.
Wonderful. So Hal, I'm going to bring you into this conversation, and I know that you have expressed that you feel that our aspirations should be a lot higher than they have been in the past, but I'll let you speak for yourself.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for attending. My name is Hal Reel. I am a white man with dark hair, no facial hair, wearing glasses, coming from a home office with a blank wall behind me. Pleasure to join everybody today. I would reframe the discussion in the United States on a federal level, regional level, state level, local level, to focus on arts as a right, not a privilege, and would try to achieve that goal by expanding the definition of art to be much more inclusive, not exclusive. And specifically, learning from the terrible tragedies of this ongoing pandemic, sort of a silver lining has been to see nonprofit and for-profit sectors begin to work together, and framing the conversation in a way that very much resonates with our advocacy efforts, the targets of our advocacy efforts, by framing it very directly in terms of economic impact. While we all are driven by our passion for what arts do for the spirit, for our sense of community, for our knowledge, for our natural sense of wonder and joy, those are not the catalyst for getting more money for more types of arts and arts organizations and artists into the system. The catalyst clearly for the Save Our Stages Act, now known as the Shuttered Venue Operators Grants, has been the direct and indirect economic impact from all of these venues and organizations having been shut down in this time period. And I think it's raised the collective visibility of the sector in terms of its economic impact as much as anything that's ever happened in the history of arts in the country. And we need to leverage that. We need to seize that moment, because we've all made the arguments that economic impact of the arts, and we've talked about it, but nothing has proven that better than people seeing these shuttered venues, shut down orchestras and organizations struggling to keep the pilot light lit by doing things virtually and so forth. But one picture of an empty performing arts center or comedy club, one picture of, that explains that there's $12 spent in the community for every dollar spent going out to see a live performance. Those have really raised the profile. And I think that's created an opportunity for us to take the conversation to another level. But again, we can only achieve that if we are more inclusive and less exclusive. And we think about arts in terms of not necessarily just the legal framework of an entity being a nonprofit versus a for-profit, that we encompass artists individually, gig workers, all of the ecosystem that makes arts in the USA so wonderful. And I think that's a lesson we've learned and we can build on moving forward.
All right. Thank you, three. So I'm going to pose some other things for us to talk about. And as I do so, I will call on people if we need, but I encourage you to step forward and just share your thoughts as I lead us into other parts of the conversation. So I know that we spoke about the importance of the creative workforce at the moment, and there are a number of proposals, some of them like the Put Creative Workers to Work proposal that a lot of people across the country have been involved in developing alongside Americans for the Arts. And there are other calls around creative workforce development. There certainly has been a recognition in this period that many people in the sector do not work in traditional forms of employment. And there are other people in other sectors of the economy who do not as well. So there have been provisions in the recent relief packages that have allowed for unemployment benefits, for example, to be extended to individuals that do not have traditional employment constructs. So I just want to pose to the group, what is it that you think our audience needs to understand about the conditions for artists and creative workers as they relate to federal policy, and anything that you would like to say about your own organization's work around creative workforce development and your commitment to better working conditions for artists and creative workers?
I'm glad that, oh, good, please.
Go ahead, Alan.
No, that's okay, go ahead, Alenta, yes.
Well, so I can start because we're knee deep in this research right now. The Academy Commission on the Arts is currently working on two core research reports, one on arts education and inequality, and the second on the creative workforce. And we were motivated by this. We actually began this conversation 2 years ago when the commission first began meeting. And we were exploring the intersections of arts and community and economic development. And we all had sort of agreed that we wanted to expand the way in which the creative economy was defined, because there are certain limitations in those in the traditional ways in which we talk about the creative economy, and that the way the arts can serve communities is more than just, you know, having an anchor theater and folks go to a show and then they go to dinner or they grab coffee. You know, oftentimes that's kind of how the people think about like the way the creative economy ecosystem works. And we really sort of see this as more deeply embedded, and that there's opportunities, untapped opportunities, that artists can play in supporting and developing local communities. So funny thing is, so we began to have this conversation about like what would a WPA, a Works Progress Administration, could look like in 2019. And since the pandemic began, these conversations have really exploded, and it's really great to see other organizations and groups having this discussion as well. What would a modern day or WPA or CETA, which means the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, which was CETA's predecessor in the 70s and 80s, could look like to support artists. But how do we better embed artists as workers? Which also means we need to redefine how we describe artists. In the mainstream, you know, artists often depicted as, you know, being part of an outside role as opposed to other workers. We've seen plenty of examples, even in mainstream media, you know, like some of you might have seen that Geico commercial when someone said, oh yeah, I'm studying communications and art. And they're like, oh, so you're not trying to make any money, or you're just gonna walk around the world not having a job. Being an artist is a job. Being a gig worker is a job. Being a production engineer, being a basket weaver, those are jobs. And those are core to the fabric of social life. And so in addition to looking at examples of artists, workforce development programs that support artists that can be enhanced, we're also looking at workforce development programs that have shown signs of success for non-artists as well. And we're paying particular attention to programs that have a strong track record, like rehabilitation job pipeline programs for folks trying to reintegrate after experiencing substance abuse, and programs for homeless, those who have experienced chronic homelessness, incarceration, reentry programs, and how can those be applied for artists as well? And at the same time, we're also thinking about unions and programs that have existed to support workers in a variety of facets that just haven't been available to artists that can be brought into this conversation. What are some best practices and models that can inform federal level policy in this current era?
Wonderful. Hal, I know you wanted to say something on this topic too, so feel free.
I will say that when we formed the National Independent Venue Association last April, as we looked around, I was astounded by how underrepresented non-middle age and older white guys were. We really, the ownership of these venues, the senior management in these venues, nonprofit and for-profit, were overwhelmingly white male, some women, very few people of color or Latinx. And we have a real opportunity to change that. And I think that we as an organization have now started a foundation, the NEVA Foundation, exactly for that mission to break down barriers of entry from all ends of the business. So we are developing a workforce training program to encourage young people 18 to 30 to learn about everything except being on stage. Lots of other opportunities for that. But to learn about everything that it takes to operate a venue, from box office to production to, in some instances, hospitality, event planning, fundraising. And we hope that we can develop those, work with some existing prototypes and develop that, and through our network of 3,000 venues, create great entry opportunities for livable wage careers in operating venues throughout the country. And at the same time, we want to expand some of the education programs that places like the one I started, World Cafe Live in Philadelphia, where you're exposing young people K through 12 to not only all kinds of music, but again, to what it takes to have these kinds of facilities and what the job and career opportunities are in the arts beyond just being the performer. And last but not least, we will be developing an entire toolkit and resource center to encourage development and ownership of venues by underrepresented people right now. We know, for example, that the SBA has programs to encourage diversified ownership in a number of businesses, but it's not enough that the SBA has a program if your local bank isn't going to get behind you and loan you the money. So we, working with some of our members who've been through this experience, are really determined to create the resources so that we can diversify the ownership. And we think in doing that, it will diversify the art that's presented, the communities that are connected, and really open up doors and break down barriers. It's really an exciting opportunity.
Wonderful. Heather, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would add just a couple of thoughts to all of that. One is kind of similar to Hal's point about the pandemic revealing the economic impact of the arts sector. I think it's also brought greater visibility to the complexity of employment relationships that the creative workforce has, from those that have a traditional W-2 employment status to those that are 1099 independent contractors, and those that have combined sources of income of that kind. And so for the very first time, we see federal law and the pandemic unemployment compensation acknowledge those relationships. They're still trying to figure it out fully and make the unemployment compensation work in a comprehensive way. But I will say we have this window of time too, where those policy leaders are starting to understand what gig workers mean. and they're starting to see how the creative workforce, how it's constructed, and how federal policy impacts it or intersects with it. So we have an opportunity to kind of, I think, create and advance our wish list of ways we'd want the federal government to better recognize those workers. And another related point is, as Hal mentioned too, data really matters in policy conversations. So at the federal level, along with our national partners, we've been looking at how does the federal government count activity in the arts sector and creative workers in the arts sector. And we'll find that the codes they use and the way they track this doesn't neatly align with the various categories of arts activity in our universe of workers. So we're looking at how do we get under the hood of that system and make sure that arts workforce is really being counted. We had some great information come out at the very start of the pandemic through the NEA's analysis of the Bureau of Economic Analysis data. But the ways that we can kind of beef that up and make sure workforce impact is getting counted in the right ways, I think will help drive policymaking in the future too.
Great. I think you all have given folks some great entry points into that topic on the level of developing models, developing new programs and initiatives to support the workforce and our future direction in terms of policy. There's certainly a lot of conversations now with regard to creative workers, artist workers, cultural workers, that we seek to extend the frameworks that were created in the context of the pandemic for relief into more permanent programs, and how do we provide unemployment support and portable benefits and a range of other opportunities to people who have different constructs of work in today's working world and environment. So I think that all of that is great. So I'm going to turn us on to some other topics that I know we wanted to cover today, and I will introduce one around arts education, which is a perennial topic in federal arts policy. And I just want to invite you all to share your thoughts on what you think the priorities are in terms of arts education policy. What are the opportunities? What's at stake at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people on this call have. Exactly, go ahead.
I'm happy to dive in.
Go ahead.
Yep. So I'd say there are 5 core priorities, and this is what we're currently our recommendations in the report we're currently drafting, which will be released in June, is focused on. The first is better data. There are a myriad of challenges around the data reporting that make it very difficult to prepare sound policy recommendations, because every state reports their education outcomes differently, and very few states have mandates to report on their arts education outcomes. So in that regard, we have about only 10 out of the 50 states actually report out on their arts education outcomes on a regular basis without being prompted to. So we've had even difficulty in our ability to capture data, to learn about what are some of the unique best practices that school districts are taking on to help us learn about arts education outcomes. So I would say first and foremost, better reporting and better data can really help, can be the first step. Secondly, funding, especially when we talk about marginalized communities where school districts rely on local tax revenues to generate funding in their cost per student. Not all communities are built the same way. There's a very different landscape and topographies in urban communities versus rural. North, south, east, west, middle America, there is just a very different composition that different communities have. And so the reliance on some of these traditional funding structures leave us behooved, because it means that historically underserved communities are only going to be perpetually underserved. And there's a correlation, as we often see, between historically underfunded school districts and school districts that have large populations of students of color and low-income backgrounds. And so that's not an accident, that's by design. So we have to redesign how the funding happens. As such, so that's on the public sphere. As such, we also are interested in developing a set of recommendations for private philanthropy, so that they're funding capacity building for school districts more than funding specific projects that they're interested in with regards to arts education. Our third recommendation is focused on teacher development. More broadly, we heard when we had organized listening sessions over the summer of last year, and we heard that oftentimes teachers were saying that they were very limited, arts educators were saying that they were limited on the kind of learning that they had, and therefore the curriculum that they were learning was very Eurocentric. And so the opportunity to learn about different multicultural forms of artistic practice in turn is limited. So you have, in an ever increasingly diverse America, students are learning sometimes one track or one-dimensional frames of artistic learning that doesn't speak to the culturally responsiveness that we need to really be directing education standards now. The other thing we also heard was just a lot of the limited, the limited access to certification, which speaks to why we're seeing a broader decrease in diverse teacher, just the teacher pool, faculty pool is increasingly less and less diverse, and that raises a lot of eyebrows and questions and concerns. But we also see there's a lot of challenges for teachers to stay in the system. And so if there's this bleeding out of our educator pool, we need to name what are those reasons. Is it because teachers are not being paid enough? And in my personal opinion, I think teachers should be paid more. But are there other constraints that they're feeling that end up driving teachers out of the school systems? That contributes to also a set of other issues. Our fourth recommendation is around curriculum standards itself. We believe the arts should be standalone arts classes should be part of the core curriculum, and that really expands beyond the math and sciences, which have been a core focus in the last few decades. Rather than just focusing on STEM, we should be focused on STEAM, and not to take away from arts integration, because we do see the arts having a fluid aspect across all subject matter. But we also would like to see standalone arts courses restored in school districts that have lost them, particularly given the many cuts that took place during the No Child Left Behind era. And our final recommendation is focused on collaborations with community groups and community-based organizations. We see this happening in school districts already, where many school districts are reliant upon partnerships with community organizations like local nonprofits to supplement extended day and out of school time programming. But we also would like to see this more embedded into the regular school day as well. That kind of strength also helps better embed the schools in communities, and doesn't isolate students from what's happening in these community-based organizations. The more collaboration also helps to foster more opportunities for funding and development, not only in public-private partnerships, but also to get more support through philanthropy. So that's all that in a nutshell.
Wonderful, Alyssa. Those are some very clear recommendations on all levels, very comprehensive, and a systemic view on the issue. Heather, I know you'll have things to share on this as well, so I want to invite you to share as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I just can only build on what Alyssa just described in terms of some near-term policy opportunities. So the first is just a reminder. I know everyone who's a practitioner in this area already knows this, but it's worth emphasizing that most of the policy decisions about access to arts education in the school system happen at the local and state level. And we know that in the wake of COVID, we're in a somewhat catastrophic situation around public education spending. So for arts stakeholders, it's so important that we be at those broader education tables where the conversations are happening at the local and state level about how resources, including COVID relief sources, will be used to support arts learning for all core subjects. And to work from kind of an asset-based notion around arts education policy, our sector has achieved huge gains in the last 20 years. So the No Child Left Behind Act articulated the arts as a core academic subject of learning. And that was carried through in the ESSA Act that we have now as federal law, as articulating art and music as a component of a well-rounded education. And what that means in practical terms is that federal funding, which is intended to be used to address gaps in equitable access to education, may be used to support arts learning. So one of our nearest term goals with the incoming administration is to have the department reissue letters, as it has in the past, clarifying that Title I resources that support the highest poverty schools can be used to support arts education. Having that reinforced at the state and local level could do a lot in these policy conversations. And then the other is to go back to this excellent point around data collection. And just over a year ago, the U.S. Department of Education removed arts education from its calendar of research on the assessment of educational progress. It was slated to be collected, it was taken off the calendar. So we are asking this administration to put the arts back on the map for routine data collection at the Department of Education. The last time the department undertook this effort, when then Secretary Duncan announced the results, it confirmed everything we really already know, was that the highest poverty schools had the least access to arts education. And that prompted him to say that access to the arts is absolutely a civil rights issue. So statements like that and revealing this data really can help drive the policy change that we need to see at the federal, state, and local levels.
All right, I'm going to turn us on to some concluding points. But before I do so, Hal, if you'd like to say anything else, I know you introduced before some of the educational initiatives that you all intend to move forward with as NEVA and with the foundation. So if you'd like to speak to any of that or anything else, please feel free to do so.
Thanks. I just will build on again what we've just heard, which is, we've all been talking STEAM, not STEM, for years. And how do you really make that happen? Heather makes a great point that it's very much at the local and state level, not just the federal level. But I think a key to creating greater access to arts learning, especially, and I couldn't agree more that it's a civil rights issue, it's a systemic racism issue, it really is very fundamental. And as I said early on, seeing arts as a right, not a privilege. I think a key to it is the recognition and us as a sector promoting that this is also a legitimate career path, that people should be able to earn a living wage as artists or as those who are supporting the artists in our communities. And I think that, collaboration is a key, so that it's not only arts in the schools, but getting, as was mentioned earlier, collaborating with community organizations that bring students into not just traditional art settings, but all kinds of art settings, and opening up their eyes at an early age to all these different pathways that are out there, how they can express themselves as artists, or they can support those who are expressing themselves as artists. And I think that collaboration and that career path mentality, that this is not, just not everybody's going to be Beyonce. There are lots of other opportunities out there for artists to express themselves and have legitimate careers, that might help us get to STEAM, not STEM, because it's, again, talking about it from a financial and career standpoint, as well as purely from a spiritual and artistic standpoint.
All right. Thanks, Hal. So before we wrap up and open this up for a Q&A, I would like us to just address with our participants, what do you consider to be the calls to action in this moment? Like, what should people know about and be referring to? How should people be focusing their advocacy efforts? What is most important right now in terms of immediate actions to take? And this could be related to the most recent pandemic relief package that is being structured or anything else. But what is a call to action to our audience?
Well, I'll be glad to take a first stab at it and say I think that we all have to get our fans, our supporters, and our colleagues to continue to press every member of the federal government and our state governments and our local governments to make the arts a priority. And the way to do that is to be focused on not just saving our stages, but illuminating our stages and our galleries and our museums, and focusing on them as being a real key to a resilient recovery, to a successful recovery. That the arts drive, again, the economic factors, that people coming to the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia or to World Cafe Live for a concert put heads in beds at the hotels, fill the bars, fill the restaurants, and give people a reason to come back out and re-engage, and that the arts can be a major driver for our recovery throughout the country.
All right.
Happy to add just a couple of thoughts to that as well. You know, as I mentioned at the top, we've got multiple policy-making moments happening all at once. And so one very near-term step is to make sure you have a really compelling narrative about how the arts can help contribute to recovery, rebuilding at the community level. And then a second piece is to also be able to clearly identify the needs not yet met through COVID relief. So we expect just within the next 2 weeks, we will see the next COVID relief package passed by Congress. They're racing to complete this before pandemic unemployment benefits are set to expire again on March 15th. So if you're not already in that conversation with your elected officials, this is the time to be letting them know where your unmet needs are. And then a third option, I think, which is kind of a longer term one, is that whether it's state officials, local officials, or especially members of Congress, given the online format of convening right now, they are perhaps more accessible than they may have ever been. And one thing that officials are doing right now is hosting town hall events, you know, moments of gathering where they want to hear what the needs are of their community. It's important not to wait for them to hold an arts town hall. The point is to attend whatever town hall is being presented and make the case that the arts are a contributor to the goals that your community is reaching for. So showing up at those events can also help you identify some unexpected allies in your community who also see the value of the arts and will make the case together with you to advance your policy needs.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we're about to open up to questions and answers. And I will say first that we'll go over by a few minutes just because we started a few moments late if need be and if people are available, but we'll launch into the Q&A shortly. I will say for our audience, in the resources section on the left-hand tab of the event site, you'll find a range of documents. 2 of those are policy recommendation documents that may help you shape some of the points that you might focus on. One of those is the arts sector and COVID-19 relief, and the other is the arts and cultural sector federal policy action. So I encourage you to look at both of those. We'll share something else in the chat in a moment that Heather has shared with us, which is basically a run through of what the current relief package contains. And so you are more aware of the topics and issues within that and then can advocate with your elected officials accordingly. So we'll open up to questions and answers. And in doing so, I'm going to invite my colleagues from the West Staff Policy Cohort to moderate this part of the session. Thanks for a great discussion so far, panelists. And I'm handing over to my colleague Brandon Jay, who serves as the ZAP Customer Support Coordinator. And so take it away, Brandon.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate it. And thank you, Hal, thank you, Heather, thank you, Alensa, for all your wonderful talking points. It's been really a great learning experience so far. So I'm going to start with just a question prompt. Kind of looking forward towards our new administration, and we do all have, I think, generally a hopeful outlook on what's to come. But one question I'd like to ask are, what are some of the strongest ways you'd like to see the new administration support arts and culture moving forward in this term? Whoever would like to start.
Well, Heather, I'll just jump in really quickly. I think, as David mentioned, in your resources tab, you will see that there is a platform of arts policy requests that has been submitted to the new administration. And this was crafted in collaboration across very many national arts organizations representing multiple parts of the creative sector. Part of the view of the way those items were addressed is to look at it through the lens of what are the priorities of this administration and how can the arts help to address them. So you'll see that those policy recommendations focus on racial justice, climate change, economic recovery and rebuilding and COVID relief, and kind of intersect with all the ways the arts can show up. And to put it as simply as possible, because the arts show up in every part of our lives, it's natural that they also show up in nearly every part of federal policy making. So we found ourselves post-COVID and deep in the weeds of banking regulations. We're looking at, in these policy recommendations, what we try to do is not just silo the arts within cultural agencies, but support those agencies and also pinpoint all of the different places in the federal government where policies that impact the strength of the arts sector are made. So in general terms, I would say our biggest hope is that the administration would take a cross-cutting view on how the arts intersect with federal policy and make sure that they're represented and also reflected in the policies of the administration. There's been a lot of talk also about, is it time to create a cabinet level position? Is it time to create some identified leadership position within the administration that's specific to the arts? And there are a lot of different configurations and ways that might go, but I think there's overall agreement that in our domestic policy agenda and also globally, we need to be proactively thinking about arts policy and formalizing our commitment to it. So you'll find more detail in that platform document, but those are some main themes.
Thank you, Heather. Hal, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the platform document's terrific. I would like to see a really robust conversation about the definition of arts and culture at the federal level. Specifically, I think that there's a lot of missed opportunity when the NEA can only fund nonprofits. And I think that even the structure that we can study other places like the UK, where there is a hybrid between a nonprofit and a for-profit organization, and you can encourage both investors and donors to participate in supporting the arts. Again, I'd love to see the conversation elevated to include the entire ecosystem, not this sort of traditional, institutionalized, some people would say snobbery of, no, the arts means the traditional institutional Western European practices. It means nonprofit organizations. It means artists who practice certain kinds of art and not others. And I think this is an opportunity and time to have this discussion in the context of racial justice, in the context of economic justice. And again, it's a great opportunity for everybody in the arts field to expand the conversation to encompass all aspects of the arts, not the limited aspects that have traditionally been included in federal policy.
Great, thank you. Alensa, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I have lost her.
All right, we'll keep moving forward. So Alenza actually brought up a great point that I wanted to bring up as a question about strengthening state and local arts. And, you know, we were just talking about how we want federal policy to not only apply to nonprofits, we want it to have a wider reach. So what do you think we can do as citizens and as members of the arts community to support our local art communities and following suggested federal policy? What are the best actions to take on a local and state level? Heather, would you like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's a two-part piece of this. So, you know, as national organizations, various service organizations, I know the National Network of State Arts Advocacy Organizations are always aiming to push out information about trends and policy at the federal level and how everyone can connect to them. It's just as important that everyone be feeding back to those associations. What is the on-the-ground experience at the community level, and where are the policy needs? So, you know, so often I think we've considered you have to wait for a call to action from someone in Washington to tell you it's time to speak up. I think if the last year has taught us anything, it's that that's not how it works, right? Your needs for federal leadership bubble up from your community, and you are expert in that, you know, as an arts maker, as an arts supporter. So I think in terms of a follow-up action, finding your voice and agency, acknowledging that when you're contacting an elected official, you're almost an extension of their staff. You are their arts policy expert, and that you're skilled and able to bring those stories forward. So that's one thing. The other is that there are networks of advocates that are working in coalitions, formal, informal, ad hoc, that reach, as Hal was saying, beyond silos, but incorporate non-arts organizations that want to advance arts policy. Find your community of advocates. Find those third-party spokespeople who might not be art producers or even consuming art, but find value in having it happen in their community, to identify that network of fellow advocates who can help bring forward these requests and case making is a really important step, I think, and it's an important infrastructure to build as we continue this, you know, long distance marathon.
I would just add to what Heather said, even what she said at the federal level, that we need to each promote in our community. The mayor's cabinet, the state level cabinet needs to have arts representation in a serious, high level way, not just as a little add-on, and that the lens needs to be applied not only to what's traditionally the arts, but to education initiatives at the state level and the local level, and to career development and workforce development initiatives. And again, it's not just this little compartmentalized, you know, this is the arts department. It affects how we work, how we live, how we play in every town, village in the country. And it's I couldn't agree more with what Heather said. It bubbles up from your local community. So, you know, cross-sector collaborations with economic development and with behavioral health and veterans programs and social service agencies, all of that is really critical to making arts a right, not a privilege, by this cross-sector approach. And it does start locally.
Yeah.
I'm just going to interject and say we're almost at 10 a.m. Mountain. We'll continue to 10:05 Mountain, if that's okay with our panelists. I know Alenza has had some technical issues and is in and out of the meeting, but hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us and comment on something before the end of time. I will bring us to time and a closure when it's time. So just.
If you all can hear me, I can still hear you.
Wonderful.
So Alenza, maybe I'll pose this question to you, because you had mentioned something along the state and local level, honing in a little bit even further to even more kind of close view of things. What do you hope to see in advocacy for the rural arts? And what do you believe the benefit in putting some of that focus into advocacy for the rural arts might be in our current stage in America?
I think building on some conversations that Hal and or points that Hal and Heather had raised, we have to reframe the narrative around the means to which we define rural communities and how we associate our our viewpoints around rural arts. I think there's a lot of stereotypes, for lack of a better term, a lot of stereotyping about how the arts service rural communities.
I think we might have lost some audio there. But if anyone, Alensa, if you're ready to jump back in a couple minutes, that'd be
Can
great.
anyone hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. You're back.
Okay.
All right.
My apologies. Just having connection issues. I was just saying that we need to reframe how we define rural communities and revisit what I think have been some long-term stereotypes that plague the way we think about arts in rural communities as well. In particular, the arts are really deeply embedded in rural communities and really serve as a foundation for economic development. One of the case studies we've been looking at is a community in Knox County in Appalachia that has been addressing their long-term substance abuse issues by teaching people to learn how to build instruments because bluegrass is so rooted in the culture there. So those are the kinds of things that we are looking at.
So we dropped out a little bit again there. But thank you, Alensa. Those are some great examples. And I think that's a great point of redefining the idea of rural communities. Does any of our other panelists have anything to add to that?
I think that the focus needs very much to turn on helping rural communities with creative placemaking. And there are real opportunities there, again, to diversify the opportunities to create art centers and support them so that the artists in those communities have places where they can stay and live in that community and practice their craft.
Great, thank you. Heather, anything to add to that?
I was just going to mention, as Hal just did, the work of Art Place and others that are, there's been a community of practice now in being able to recognize art making in all the places where it's happening. And also, I think it's a real opportunity to also make sure that we're thinking about a whole new issue we haven't talked about today, but broadband access. Kind of paired with public education resources and the emphasis on equitable access to public education. We should also be, part of the communities that are driving important conversations around broadband access and especially rural broadband access, because that's now part of the arts infrastructure as well.
Very good point. Yep.
I think the issue of broadband access is a really.
Looks like you cut out there again, Alensa. Sorry about that.
I was just saying that I want to second Heather's point about broadband access, because it's not just rural communities, it's also in core parts of urban communities as well. I'm kind of dealing with that right now with my connection issues. I live in a part of Boston that doesn't have the same level of access, broadband access, that other parts of the city does, where there are certain parts of the city, there's even free Wi-Fi that the city sponsors. In the Black and brown neighborhoods, we don't have the same level of access. And so connectivity issues is like literally playing out right now. But broadband, I think, in particular, trying to address the inequities around broadband, not just in rural communities, but in urban communities as well, where we see just large parts of disconnection is really important.
Absolutely. All right, well, we're at time. I want to thank everyone for participating today, all of our panelists. Thank you, Brandon. Thank all of my colleagues for making this happen, and we hope you can join us for the session later today and our sessions tomorrow. So thanks again, and thank you for participating in ALIS 2021.